Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Kupyansk, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line, both in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians, although mainly the Russians. We're also seeing some very interesting developments taking place both to the east of Pokrovsk and in the Kupyansk direction, where the Ukrainians and the Russians are both launching active offensive operations, which means that some areas end up in a large gray zone, and there's a lot of back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians in these areas. Starting out in the eastern outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians have managed to capture the town of Novoselivka. It was previously reported that the Russians managed to enter into the settlement, following which a Ukrainian counterattack took place, which allowed them to resecure the settlement and push the Russians back to the forest lines. Now the Russians have yet again entered the settlement, captured the fortified positions east of it, and gained full control of it, raising the flag in the southern, northern, and central parts of the settlement, as we see with this geolocated footage. The Russians are here managing to secure the settlement of Novoselivka along the Vovcha River line, following the capture of Oleksandrorad further north, and with an ongoing siege over Sichneve. The Russians have also managed to reach the outskirts of Vorone. The Russians are here looking to encircle the Ukrainian positions along the fortifications and within the settlement of Sichneve. Securing Sichneve, the fortifications, and Vorone will allow the Russians to secure the northern flank of some of these fortified positions along the second line of defense and continue to advance along the Vovcha River line, further isolating the Ukrainian forward positions here on the southern bank of the Vovcha River line and creating a front line alongside the river line as a defensive line, especially in the fall and winter seasons. Once the rain increases, the river line will become more of a hurdle, while in the summer season, if there's not a lot of rain, then the river level drops to a point where infantry and vehicles can easily cross over, while in the rainy seasons it's very difficult. Moving on to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain control over Troyanda and additional parts of the forest patch area here to the south of the city. Positional fighting continues on the roads leading into Pokrovsk as Russians looking to gain control over the western Shakhtarsky road to cut off the supplies leading into the Shakhtarsky district and to have additional roads into it from the rear and from the front, while at the same time they're looking to secure the flanks of the supply lines into the city itself to strengthen the garrison of it and expand offensive operations within it to cut off the E50 highway at the entrance to the city and reach through the main highway up towards the northern flank to further isolate Mirnorad and the Hrishine supply lines leading into the city. The Russians, with their push into the central parts of the city, are challenging the Ukrainian positions along the apartment complex areas in the central parts of it, as well as the Shakhtarsky district. Both of these are filled with high-rise buildings, which allows for an overview over the city. If the Russians are able to gain control over the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city, they'll be able to overlook the highway that connects the supplies to the Shakhtarsky district, allowing for direct fire control of it, especially if they infiltrate the residential area to the east of the apartment complex area with the apartment complex area as their main base of operations within the city. Cutting off the supply lines to the Shakhtarsky district will make it so it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control of it. A combined push through Ekonomichne up towards Novopavlivka through the railway area will also allow the Russians to physically completely encircle the Shakhtarsky district from the eastern and northern flanks. To the east of Mirnorad, there is a lot of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. First, the Ukrainian forces started storming the industrial area here to the west of Ekonomichne. The Russians stormed the Ukrainian fortified positions southwest of Ekonomichne, gaining control over the river line to the south, leading into the Mirnorad direction. The Ukrainians have their own apartment complex area here in the eastern parts of Mirnorad as well, which overlooks these fortifications and fields to the east of it as they have the high ground positions. This allowed the Ukrainians to launch a counterattack, and combined with this counterattack, they also launched an operation from Mikhailivka up towards the southern parts of Ekonomichne. At that point, the Russians had control over the fortified positions to the west of Ekonomichne and half of the industrial area. The Ukrainians reportedly had success in the industrial zone, allowing them to recapture it and then push into Ekonomichne through the main highway. Combined with an assault from the south, they managed to enter the central parts and southern parts of Ekonomichne. However, geolocated footage has just appeared of the Russians appearing just east of Milnerad at the fortified positions just east of the city. This raises the question as to how firm is the Ukrainian control within Ekonomichne? Do they have control over the industrial area, or is it still contested after weeks of fighting? Who controls the fortified positions west of Ekonomichne? To my understanding, it is likely that the majority of these areas are simply empty. Neither side has been able to consolidate and entrench themselves within these positions due to the constant back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. Therefore, the Ukrainians are able to drive straight into Ekonomichne, following which they will be fighting Russian forces, and are unable to establish themselves within the town. Then the Russians will launch their own operations to gain control over the further westernmost part of it, try to entrench themselves there. However, the Ukrainians, with the high ground under their control and a constant counterattack, are able to push the Russians out, leaving the area in between Ekonomichne and Milnerad a no man's land or a gray zone. Therefore, until we get clear confirmation that either side controls the area, I will leave it as a gray zone here to the east of Milnerad. Further north, there's also some back and forth as the Ukrainians continued operations to recapture Nikhonorivka to cut off the supplies going further north towards Kucheryev Yar and Novoshakhove, while the Russians are storming Novoshakhove and the area just north in the direction of Vilna, where they're looking to gain control over these settlements on the western flank and flank the positions of the Ukrainians in the direction of Doreshne. That is to cut off the main supply line supplying the Ukrainian forces launching their offensive operations in the direction of Nikhonorivka, and also to establish Doreshne as a westernmost outpost for their resupply of the forces further north, and to develop offensive operations along the railway area towards Dobropilya. That is also to secure the defensive line here to the west of Nikhonorivka along the railway area, to secure the northern flank for offensive operations in the direction of Rodinske, Mirnorad, and further north. If the Ukrainians are able to secure Nikhonorivka, they'll be able to start a push in the direction of Boykivka and Mayak here along the river line. That is to encircle the Russian forces operating north of these settlements and to flank the defensive line of the Russians in the western direction and push down towards Fedorivka, Satyshok, and cut off the Russian positions west of the Kazany-Turets river line. We're seeing a general offensive by the Ukrainians alongside the river line to cut off the Russian positions on the western bank of it, securing the northern and eastern flank of Pokrovsk and Mirnorad. People have asked me in my comments, well, there's been a lot of developments in favor of the Russians over the past few days, and there's not really been that many developments in favor of the Ukrainians, yet you said that there was a Ukrainian offensive that started just a few days ago. How is that the case? Well, it's fairly simple. We are simply not seeing a lot of developments because both the Russians and the Ukrainians are launching offensive operations. That means both of them will slow down with their advances because they're attacking the same places. That means more head-on clashes and face-to-face clashes. To explain it in simple terms, the Russians launch an assault with an armored vehicle and some infantry. At the same time, the Ukrainians do the same. That means neither side will be able to capture territory because they'll be fighting each other instead. Whoever comes out on top will be able to capture the area, but because it's an offensive, it's part of a larger operation, there's not just one wave, there's 10, 20, 100 waves, where they constantly attack back and forth between each other over the same piece of territory. While over the past few months, when we have seen the Russians making a lot of advances and the Ukrainians making few advances, that is because the Russians were the ones launching the operations. Armored vehicle and a few infantry pushed towards Kucheryev Yar. The Ukrainian garrison has been defeated, they captured the settlement, and then onwards to the next position. That's when they captured the territory and then push onwards. When they don't capture territory, well, the front simply doesn't move, but simply because they're the ones attacking and the Ukrainians are the ones defending, they'll eventually be losing more and more territory. It is similar to at the start of this year in the months between January and March, where the Russians were barely capturing territory compared to April to July, where the Ukrainians were not launching an offensive operation, where the first 3 months of this year, the Russians were capturing about 300 square kilometers a month, where in the summer period it was about 600 kilometers per month. And that is simply because the Ukrainians stopped their own offensive operations in the areas where the Russians were launching their own offensives to build up their forces to now start their offensive operations again. And that is why the Ukrainians are launching operations in waves. That is because they do not have the necessary resources and manpower to constantly be doing this, while the Russians have been constantly doing this since October of 2023 during the Avdiivka offensive until now, where they've continuously been launching offensive operations one after another. I've already previously said another Kursk offensive, another summer 2023 offensive, these will never happen again by the Ukrainian side. If the situation continues as it is, the Ukrainians are simply not receiving enough armored vehicles, tanks, and weapons to launch offensive operations such as those. Further north in the direction of Lyman, the Russians consider offensive operations in between Sarishne and Shandriolova, getting control of additional parts of the first patch areas as they are inching forward towards the capture of the supply routes leading into Lyman. In the Kupyansk direction, a similar situation to the east of Mirnogorod, where a lot of back and forth is happening on the western outskirts of the town. The Ukrainians are constantly launching counterattacks from the railway area and from the southern and southwestern directions to regain control over Moskovka and push the Russians out of the city. In turn, the Russians continue offensive operations within it, looking to regain control over the northern parts, consolidate their possessions, and gain full control of it. This geolocated footage confirms Russian positions in several parts of the city. However, as we always see with these ongoing offensives by both the Russians and the Ukrainians, the positions are only temporary, as the Ukrainians will be counterattacking any position the Russians capture. Sometimes they hold on to them, sometimes they lose them. That is why the storming of Kupyansk has taken such a long time. As soon as the Russians gained a foothold within the city, the Ukrainians started their counterattacks, and it has intensified over the past few days since I made the video talking about the Ukrainian offensive. We're seeing the Ukrainians use everything they have available to stop these offensive operations, to prevent any sort of local collapse along the front line without the loss of Pokrovsk, Kupyansk, Lyman, or Kupiansk. Each of them will have a significant impact on the frontline situation and the Ukrainian defensive capabilities. Especially Pokrovsk, which is the center of the fighting as it stands right now. Capturing Pokrovsk will open the road for the rear of the Donetsk region and significantly complicate the situation for the Ukrainian forces within the Slovyansk-Koshentinivka line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.